There could only be one interpretation. With a constriction of his stomach, Kidd knew that an empty cable was running now from the hawse. As if in confirmation, Trajan gave a fish-like wriggle as she careered astern. Kidd spun round. He hurried as fast as he could to make the upper deck, pulling along hand over hand. As he got to the base of the ladderway, a combined twist and jerk told him that Trajan had come up to her second anchor. "Clear away the sheet anchor!" Kidd heard the boatswain howl into the violence as he breasted the coaming and came out into the turmoil. Capel stared fiercely ahead on the foredeck where men fought and struggled. At every plunge they disappeared from view under an avalanche of white water. He noticed Kidd. "Coral bottom!" he shouted. Coral was a deadly menace. It snarled and cut thick cables with razor-sharp edges, and normally was never chosen for an anchorage. A few yards forward, Kidd saw Quist. He was yelling something indistinct, but ended by stabbing a finger at Kidd, then pointing forward. Kidd grabbed the wet hairiness of the midship's lifeline and hauled himself along the bucking deck to the starboard forechains, joining the men at the sheet anchor. There was no immediate need for this last anchor they had, but they could leave nothing to chance. Kidd drew near and was nearly knocked off his feet by the green water sluicing aft. A cable to the sheet anchor had already been bent and seized in storm preparations, but anchoring in coral had not been foreseen. "Keckling! Get going, Kidd!" the boatswain yelled. A coil of 3-inch line was thrown at him. It thumped heavily into his chest. The seas roared against the side, burying the channel, the broad base of the shrouds fitted to the outside of the ship. Kidd caught his breath. He knew they were telling him to climb over the bulwarks and down onto that channel to work at the stowed black mass of the sheet anchor and its cable. He looked back resentfully at the row of men who looked more gravely back at him. They were older and more experienced, but would be able to remain safely inboard. Then he understood. He had been chosen for this job because he was a better seaman than they. The realization warmed him, proofed him against the elements, and, with a jaunty wave, he swung over the bulwarks and dropped to the channel. It had crossed his mind to bend on a lifeline around his waist, but if he was swept away, then the sudden jerk at the end of the line might cut him in half. In any case, the light line would get in his way. The sea-glistening sides of the ship dipped slowly, and Kidd hung on grimly to the tarry shrouds. The expected seas came. First his feet, thighs, and then above his waist. A rushing torrent, bullying and jostling, tearing at his hold on life. It seethed around the lower rigging and fittings with a deep hissing and roaring, then began to recede. Kidd snatched a glance at the situation. His task was to apply keckling to the last yards of the cable as it came from the sheet anchor, wrapping his lighter line, and stout strips of canvas handed down to him, tightly about the strands of the cable. It was their only chance, the keckling their sole means to protect this last anchor from the deadly sharp coral and keep the ship from driving ashore. The sheet anchor was lashed outside the shrouds, outside the channel, and Kidd was exposed to the seas. Edging around the aftermost shroud, he stood on the iron curve of the flukes of the big anchor, then swung to the channel and shuffled along. Trajan rolled, the seas rose and battered and tugged at him. He held the thick shrouds in a death grip, pressing his face to their rough surfaces, feeling their sturdy strength. The seas fell away as the ship began a laborious roll upwards. It was time to get to work. Kidd moved outboard of the anchor to the big ring beyond the stock. He waited for the surging seas to return and subside, then bent to begin. The rope had a mind of its own, snarling and writhing, but Kidd forced it round. More seas, but his work held, and when the dripping cable appeared, his keckling was still there. He worked feverishly, his arm hooked about the cable, but such was his concentration that when the next sea came it took him unawares. A momentary vision of the water within inches, then he was submerged, buffeted by giant forces while he hugged the cable, a maelstrom of roaring in his ears. He emerged, bruised and gasping, his eyes stinging, a salty burning in his throat, but he went on grimly. His first sea friend, Boyer, a deep-sea mariner of the very best kind, came to mind, and memories of lessons in the sea crafts, and he responded. Every working of cordage and cable would be the best he could manage. Unexpectedly, he felt a tug on his shoulder from above. Stirk's hand came out, and Kidd was hoisted bodily over the bulwarks. He sank to all fours with exhaustion, hearing Stirk's murmured words of encouragement, then noticed buckled shoes and silk stockings. He looked up to see the captain gazing down at him, then his slow nod of approval.